and good afternoon to everybody who is in the platform. This is the State of Youth annual dialogue convened by the Policy Space, which is one of the public policy think tanks in South Africa, a truly Pan-African institution. We welcome everybody. We are going to start shortly. When it comes to the question of time, I always make the uncomfortable joke that if any one of you has been to China once in their lives, or you have attended an online event organized by the Chinese people, you would know that when they say we're starting at 5:30, exactly at 5:30, the event begins. You know, 5:30, it's not the time when you are plugging in your computers, and it's when the lecture actually begins. So there's quite a big cultural shock for myself, but I think we will just probably start officially in a minute from now, so that we don't waste a lot of time, and most importantly, so that we can respect those that have arrived on time. Just the basic rules for now. The basic rules is that please keep your microphones off and your videos off. When you want to speak, you can raise your hand virtually, and we will open for that after the presentations. The other important part is that you are not really obliged to show your video when you make a comment or ask a question. But I think what is also important in your comments and your questions is that please try to keep them brief and to the point, so that we can take as many comments and questions as possible. We should not exceed a minute and 30 seconds per person. Just try to be precise and ask as much as you can. We can limit you to about 2 questions per person, but in totality, you have about 90 seconds to raise your question. We also do this because we want to keep to time. Online seminars and discussions should not last more than 2 hours. And we also do this because we know that the cost of data is not really cheap here in this country. So we need to be considerate of that. Yeah, so yeah, let's start. We have a very welcome to our dialogue, the State of Youth in South Africa dialogue. It's an annual dialogue which we're launching this year for the first time in the history of the Policy Space. We're hoping we can have a much more exciting and a bigger event next year. But really, we must extend our greatest appreciation to the stakeholders and the speakers in the panel who have agreed graciously to be the first people to actually launch this dialogue. And we hope that next year they can join us again in different capacities. But we also do welcome all the participants who have put everything else aside to be part of us today. We are very much delighted to be hosting this on the last day of the Youth Month, specifically to basically conclude and reflect back on what has transpired, the conversations we've had over the month, and whether we're able to move the needle and to what extent we're able to move the needle. And I'm mindful of the fact that this conversation is taking place at a very difficult moment, not only in South Africa, but globally, because we are faced with the global pandemic, which all of us are quite fully aware of. Just a bit about, I would start off by marketing our organization. We are a progressive Pan-African think tank established this year for the first time in February, launched publicly. And we intend and hope that we can make a telling contribution to the think space in South Africa. And I must declare that this is a platform and a space open to everyone who really believes in a truly progressive South Africa and a future in which we all belong as South Africans. And so if you have any questions you want to raise or any ideas you want to share, the policy space is actually your friend, and you should feel free to associate with this platform. We must also indicate that on our website, our full details are available for those of you who wish to support us in different ways, including starting with donations of just merely 5 rands. They are very much welcome. We have convened this dialogue today primarily because we want to reflect on the central question: the state of youth in South Africa. Is South Africa marking time? I think that the problems and the issues and the challenges facing the youth in our country are quite well canvassed over the years and across many platforms and organizations. I don't want to repeat or single out any of them, but right from the employment question, right through to skills, right up to technology, as well as climate change, most of these issues affect the youth more acutely than they affect any other category. Because as we will see with the numbers, the youth constitutes the majority, and their issues and their concerns become very urgent and important. I just want to tease off, because mine is not to speak today, it's just to facilitate. I just want to start off by saying that historically, there have been at least about 2 critical moments that have sort of been very critical to define the state of youth or the character of youth. In the early 1990s, there was a public discourse that was led primarily in the right-wing circles, in the liberal media and other spaces, where a view had emerged that what we actually have after the period of the roaring 1980s, where young people were actually rallied to fight against the apartheid regime as a last push, is that the period from 76 right up to 80 in early 90s had produced what was called at the time the lost generation. And that discourse was beginning to be dominant, but it was countered because in the end, there was consensus that what had actually happened in that period and to the young people of that period was actually the fact that the system was actually lost to the youth as opposed to the youth being lost to the system. And this is very crucial because the youth were actually seen as a problem and were actually seen as a people that are destructive in society, a destructive element. And by youth problem, they were actually referring to Black youth in the township. And we know what that system had done since the 1970s or even much earlier, to that generation of young people. So in the end, it was agreed that the youth problem or the youth question is actually not a problem of a lost generation, but a system that has actually lost young people. The second area was the one that was promoted largely and quite rightly so by Stats SA, when they were looking at the numbers in the middle of the 2000s and the end of the first decade of the 21st century, was that it's possible that South Africa and Africa could possibly face the danger of actually missing what is called the demographic dividend. That you've got a large number of young people that are out there in the system, in the schools and so on, but are so much in the margins of society, so much that we will not take advantage of the large numbers of young people who are young, energetic, capable, productive, and willing to contribute to the development of our country. And that is what was meant by the danger of missing the demographic dividend, because if more of young people constitute our population and they do not have opportunities or access, then that in itself is a problem, and that may constitute us missing the demographic dividend. Now, we all know, right from June 16 here in South Africa to the 26 July movement in Cuba, as well as the Arab Spring about a decade ago, as well as the Fees Must Fall, and right now, the uprisings in Swaziland. We all know that at the center of those historical moments in history is actually young people that are in the forefront of those particular struggles, and actually highlighting to society that things need to change and change for the better. Now, I know that solutions are very much many, but I do think that, and this is my perspective and my view, is that I think some of the solutions we should explore actually lie in the intersection of just two issues. One is that every society, every state establishes its legitimacy on the basis of economic development. That you've got to industrialize, you've got to develop, you've got to grow the economy, you've got to be inclusive. On the other hand, the relationship between the state and private players, business, companies, and so on, both domestic and global, is actually quite crucial to actually unlock the opportunities that young people should have access to. So with those few words, I'm going to start off by allowing, I think you've seen in the poster in our panel, we've got Faisal is going to start by giving us a presentation for about 12 minutes or so, talking about the state of youth from the perspective of figures and numbers. Faisal is actually a principal marketing officer at Stats SA, and he has been working a lot with the data that is usable and user-friendly to various sectors in our society. Faisal, I'll give it to you to break the ice and take us through the numbers as much as we can, and then we open up the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, to my colleagues, and everybody that's interested in actually developing youth and looking to the issues that we should be facing with the youth. I will be presenting various numbers, just giving you a brief outline in some of the issues that are affecting our youth. And I get very passionate about numbers. So if you will at any point stop me and tell me this is it, the storyline is complete wherever we stop, because I think we understand the numbers as they come through. Okay, so in this, I'm going to briefly talk about Status A, just to give you an overview of our role and the role even within this presentation about how we go about our thinking. We are an independent organization mandated and regulated by the Statistics Act, and that guarantees our independence, but we are still accountable to the Minister and the Presidency, still a national government department, and we adhere to a range of procedures and guidelines such as the UN Official Principles of Statistics. We publish around about 300 social and economic statistics a year, so we really get in to understand the nature of the country. But primarily, we focus on one point, which is the outcomes and outputs. That's kind of where we sit. So let's look at a department like Department of Human Settlements. They have to think about housing, how many people would be required to build, what materials do they need, what processes do they need, and they come to an output. How many houses have they built? So sometimes Stats SA will look at figures like that. How many of the houses have been built? And also the outcome. What percentage of those houses, what percentage of the country is living in formal houses, living in informal settlements, living in traditional housing? That's kind of our role. We're sitting there at the outcome and the output phases. Now, we don't really talk about the impact. What does it mean if somebody is living in informal housing? What life circumstances change if you are now living in formalized housing, if water is now inside your home instead of outside your home? So these are some of the questions that we generally don't dabble in. We always like to say we have no taste buds. And so some of our colleagues that are sitting here today will actually have very much those strong taste buds to say that data is telling us to go in this direction or that direction. And that's our primary role, to give you the data to enable you to make those decisions. So let's start off, big picture. The first thing we're looking at is how big is our country? And we're close to knocking on 60 million people. And a lot of then myths come around with that 60 million people. And people will tell you, no, we've been flooded in, it's migration. No, it's not migration. You can see clearly that births are still the main driver of population. Between 2019 and 2020, you can see 1.17 million births. Net migration only accounted for about 200,000 people, deaths about 500,000. And that brings up to another common myth that you may think, that people are having babies, that it's going in one direction, and that's not also the case. We know that fertility has come from a high of 2.66 children per woman down to about 2.33 in 2020. So there's a lot of myths and things that you need to put into perspective when you look at the numbers. Look at the numbers, take them, understand what context they provide. Our country is really divided. We have these three big provinces, Gauteng, KZN, Western Cape, Eastern Cape almost catching up to Western Cape. But you can see close to 60% of our population are focused there. That's where the youth, there's also a lot of youth in Gauteng, KZN, and a lot of youth migration into those provinces like Gauteng and the Western Cape. That means that a lot of those services can be easily rolled out to lots of people. But in rural areas where people are more dispersed and the landscape, for example, in Eastern Cape makes it difficult to pump water to some places, we have to think about what are the additional things. We have to take note of how our country is, the apartheid spatial plans that there were, and let's see how do we change it. But what right now we can see is that close to 60% live in three provinces, and Gauteng dominates with almost a quarter of our population. Now, let's get into the youth and let's look at them quickly. So you can see we are a young population. Look at that little bluish bar there of youth 15 to 34, 20.7 million. We are a young country. The median age is 27 years old. So if you walked around and you saw enough people, the average age around there, the median would be 27. And that means we have a lot of potential. David was mentioning the demographic dividend. How do you harness the dividend when clearly we have the ingredients in the form of youth, but you need other ingredients in terms of that as well, in terms of economic growth and a few other things as well. So let's look at some of that. But The youth isn't stagnant and our country isn't stagnant. We showed you it's growing. And between 2002 and 2020, we moved from 16.5 million in those between 15 and 34 to 20.7 million, now being the largest structure, or the largest part of our population. Children, 15 million to 17 million. You can see that that growth isn't as fast. And obviously, we're also seeing growth in our elderly population. So even though we are a young country, we are generally moving towards an older age profile. Now, let's put a context. So I'm a young person. The country is, well, I'm not, but let's put it into context of being a young person. In what economy do we find? And we can see that 2006, 2007, we were kind of achieving the NDP's targets of above 5.4% growth. We were achieving that, and going past 2009, 2008, the financial crisis, we've never achieved those levels again. And you can see we've been slowly coming downwards. And in 2020, obviously the big tsunami of the pandemic hitting us and dropping our annual GDP rate by negative 7%. So we can see the problems that we've had doesn't come just in this last bit. It doesn't just come here with a pandemic, but we can see that we haven't had this engine of growth to drive and absorb the multitudes of people that are coming into the labor force. I wanted to briefly touch on this and talk about a few changes that we've had in our country. We've had a situation where manufacturing used to rank the #1 contributor to GDP, and it's now #4. It's overtaken by many others, including finance. And finance, and as you know, we work, a lot of people could say, okay, in the finance sector, they could work remotely, they could work from their just laptops, they could easily change because finance is dominated by a lot of technology. And that is some of the questions that we've had to ask, and we will ask a bit of that later in terms of how does technology, automation, 4IR, because our country as a whole, in terms of the GDP figures, is moving to that phase. And as you can see it, with issues like finance, but finance doesn't really create the jobs relative to its share. Those things go like agriculture and construction, and they create far more jobs relative to their share, but they're much smaller. You can see agriculture is only 3% of contribution to GDP. These are questions that we have to understand, the broader questions of how the youth find themselves in. Now, big picture about unemployment, and this gets news a lot. We've got about 15 million people employed within the country, 7.2 million unemployed, and then we have an additional category. You can see there right next to it, 3.1 million discouraged. So the official unemployment rate stands at 32.6%. But if we look at those that are discouraged as well, we can see that the expanded one, discouraged workers, 3.1 million, plus those have other reasons not for searching, that's sitting at 11.4 million for the expanded definition, 43.2%, and official 32.6%. So while those numbers are high, when we look at those, when we look at the youth numbers and the official rate here, and you're looking at 63.3% of youth unemployment, 25 to 34 at 41.3. So they're simply not being absorbed or participating in the economy to the degree that their numbers could be given that that youth bulge that we have in our country. But education makes a difference. You can clearly see that when you have graduates out there, even though we do see anecdotal evidence of many graduates, and at the individual level, it's heartbreaking to see that there's graduates and they're putting up, but at aggregate level, you can actually see that graduates are having a much better time of finding employment, sitting at 9.3% compared to the others. Less than matric, you almost close to 40% at your official unemployment rate, and matric around about 34%. So these are questions that we have to ask in terms of the education system, the skills, and the skills required by both the workplace and moving into this new fourth industrial revolution, or just looking at how things have changed just since the pandemic started. And when we look at those 15 to 24, 15 to 34, we can see that clearly there is a lot of people who are not in employment, education, training. And you can see this is from 2012 all the way to 2021. We aren't really pushing that. Even though the amount of youth are growing, the proportions are staying the same. So we can see there about 32.2%, 32.4% of 15 to 24-year-olds are not in education and training, and that obviously translates into millions, as you can see, millions of people who are sitting at home and what are they doing? What can they do? Education and work provide structure to daily lives. And if we take that structure away, what do youth do with the time that's on their hands? Now, often we say that the informal sector is the employer of last resort. And when you see that, you can see that as you get older and you can't find employment, possibly you go into the informal sector, you start selling anything, you start working. But for the youth, that's especially 15 to 24, that doesn't seem to be an attractive option. All the way from 2001 to 2017, we can see they aren't taking up that space. They aren't saying, well, I'm not in education and employment. I might work in the informal sector. You can see that that's not the space. But as you get older and possibly you have to feed family, you have to do a range of things, you might look to the informal sector as where, and you can see the age 45 to 54, and those age groups have much higher percentage of the working age population working in that informal sector. Now, coming close to the end of the presentation, because this was just to give you a broad overview of some of the issues and challenges facing the youth today. Now, one of the really great things that we've seen over time is the total amount. You can see this in primary school, that we have so many, almost complete coverage, 100% of those aged between 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 12 in primary school. You can see that that is such an amazing thing. But as you go to the right-hand side, you can see that transition from primary to secondary is mostly there all the way up to age 15. You can see that some people are in primary school all the way 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old and still in primary. And what does that mean for those particular people? And what does that mean for the rest of the kids in the class? Those are some of the things that we'd look at. But from that transition, so the strong transition from primary to secondary is there, but the transition from secondary further. And remember, we're talking about economy that is moving into financialization and so forth as the bigger shares of GDP. So that's where the money is, you could basically say. But you can see that in terms of going to university or TVET, those numbers drop significantly. You don't have this big wave of transition into further education. And you can see most of the other block would be not in education or training. And we've seen those numbers provided earlier. So sometimes we ask that question of, well, you're not in school, why are you not in school? For those who don't make it through the system between the age of 17 to 18, we ask the question, and you can see no money for fees is still one of the biggest contributors. Poor academic performance, no money for fees, in terms of even if there's no fee schools, there are other costs associated with getting to school. There are those costs of saying, well, I just don't have money. And there's many children that would fall into that bracket. But I want to focus on one particular thing called family commitments. You can see with family commitments, males, 0.3%. So family commitments, whether you're taking care of an uncle, you're taking care of the household, or you're simply taking care of your own child, really doesn't affect males. But look at females, 17.1%. Family commitments are the reason why I don't go to school of those who are not in school. Let's flip the thing a bit and let's talk about education is useless. And you can see suddenly males say, no, education is useless. So females say that to quite a lesser degree, 6.1%. So you can see that females have lots of things. They want to go to school, but there are family commitments. They don't believe that education is useless. They can see that education, as the numbers say, is one of the ways out of poverty, one of the ways out into a better life. Now, we've seen tremendous growth in terms of those achieving grade 12. And this figure talks to those aged 20 years and older. And you can see that South Africa in general, let's look at the blue bar. South Africa, 30.8% is actually achieving grade 12. And most of the provinces are pretty much close to that average, except for Limpopo and Eastern Cape. But you can see a lot of the provinces are close to the average and moving across. But going further, you can see that within our own country, we have a lot of ways where GP is sitting at 21%, Northern Cape at 9.2%, and yet Northern Cape is much closer to the average when reaching matric. Northwest, for example, 29.2 reaching grade 12, 10.7 reaching post-school education. These are questions that you have to ask, isn't it? Some of the provinces are shooting far ahead, some of them are still staying behind. What is it? How do you achieve the same results in Mpumalanga, in Northern Cape, in Free State, as you would? So you can see definitely there's an uneven space between those achieving matric and those achieving further post-school education. Now I'm going to go on to the last two slides and then just also talk about those who've actually been employed. So I'm looking at the people that are employed, and we rank or put them in different categories: skilled employment, professionals, technicians, semi-skilled, clerks, craft, and elementary, which include domestic workers and those in elementary skills, or low skills. What can you have with your skills? And let's start this. And so this is of those who are employed. So we go out there when the QLFS asks, are you employed? In which industry are you? In which occupation? And we can then derive the skill levels. And in 1994, you can see for Black, African, and colored compared to Indian, also was not too far off, but compared to their white counterparts. So within each age group, you could see that there was a large difference. So let me take, for example, a white person, 1994, age 35 to 44. 48% of them were in the high skilled, were in the skilled occupations. So 5 out of every 10, if you would look for a white person in age 35 to 44, you would find 5 out of every 10 that you asked that were employed were in a skilled occupation. Now let's go down the line. Let's look at, for example, colored people in 1994, 15 to 24. Amongst that youth group, the most of them would only be, so 7 out of 100 would be in the skilled group. And you can see that dramatic difference where you have 5 out of 10 or 7 out of 100, or basically one out of 10 if you look at that number that way. So you can see the big difference in the backlog. So now let's zoom over to 2020 and see what has changed in terms of the skilled profile that we have there. And you can see for white and Indian, the Indian population group has in fact caught up to the majority of the white population group. In many respects, they're almost at the same levels. And we see this also in their educational attainment, much higher levels of education attainment over this time period. But let's look at colored and Black African, which almost show the same proportions. And there you see
Faisal, am I the only one who has lost the audio of Faisal?
Yes, the audio is gone.
Oh, his audio is fine. I can't hear him, but okay, it's fine.
Well, we can
No,
hear you.
we've lost you.
We can hear you, but I think the time as well is fine.
Faisal, can you hear me? Faisal? Faisal?
Yes.
Okay, Faisal, can you just say your concluding remarks again? We lost you on the 2 last slides. Sorry, man.
that is not a problem. Okay, so I will come back to here. Okay, so the breakdown.
The next one. I think, yeah, the next one. Yeah.
The next one. Okay.
Yeah.
So okay, apologies for that. Speaker system must have died on me. But let's look at 1994 and let's look at the skills levels here. So we see in 1994, now we see there are skilled people and there are those that are not skilled or fall in different, those in skilled occupations and those in the low skilled. And we can see that those in the skilled occupation professions, technicians, and so forth, in 1994, the backlog is visible. You can see that for the white population group, 25 to 34, 41 already. So 4 out of every 10 people, young people in that age group, were already in a skilled work, were already ready to take on the challenges of the 4th industrial revolution and so forth. Now let's zoom all the way, because you can see the big difference for Black Africans. In 25 to 34 was sitting at 17 over there. But now let's look all the way to 2020. And what we see here is that for the demographic dividend, you can pretty much see that for Indian and white, they've achieved that demographic dividend within the young population group. Look at those between the age of 25 and 34. 6 out of every 10 of those people are sitting in that age group, are sitting in skills. They are more resilient to handle the issues of the automation and the 4IR has been mentioned. But let's look down and see for the majority of the population. Remember, in South Africa, 8 out of 10 people are Black African. And when we look at that age group, 25 to 34, we can see that drop from 17%, so 17 out of 100 people you met. That's a very low proportion, because you would have hoped that thing would have moved forward. But that 17 out of 100 people you would have met would have been in the skilled category of employment. And if we look now, we see that's only 14 out of 100. So we have to wonder about what are the skills, what are the education system offering, what are the jobs being offered by the workplace, how do you industrialize, how do you localize? These are questions that Stats SA can't answer. We can definitely show you the data, and what the data is showing is that there are these issues of uneven development within our country. Some of that demographic dividend has been achieved, but really not for all. I thank you, and I apologize for the dropping of the network there.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you so much. I think we will go right straight, in the interest of time. We'll go straight to the CEO of the National Youth Development Agency. Hope very much, sir, that you have a board very soon. Welcome, Wasim. I think he needs no introduction. He's the CEO of the NYDA, so really take us through.
Thank you, Comrade David, and greetings to all of the young people and all of my fellow young panelists. And thank you so much for putting this policy debate together. I think we underscore the amount of policy discussions that we should have as young people, and I think it's very relevant as we close out Youth Month. So, rightly so, this conversation today continues to focus on the burning challenge of youth unemployment. And I think we should never lose sight about the really atrocious effects of youth unemployment. And it goes beyond a statistic on a piece of paper. When we speak about youth unemployment, we speak about the hopes and dreams of our young people. You know, it's the young person who wants to build a house or furnish a house for their parents, but can't do so because they feel trapped in unemployment. It's the young person who has dreams for the future, who doesn't know the joy of cashing a paycheck or knocking off on a Friday afternoon. And that is what youth unemployment steals from our young people. Yeah. But I also think it's important to reflect that youth unemployment is an outcome of how we have framed young people in a democratic South Africa. And I think if we look at the majority of the reporting around young people, how we frame that argument is very negative in nature. Just words like ticking time bomb and burden of youth unemployment reflects young people as not as assets, but as these sort of liabilities that need to be managed and taken care of, or they'll explode, which is not necessarily the case. So in many cases, all the people have united in bad leadership and have pushed young people to the margins of society. Yeah? I think another challenge that sometimes we face is that many young people of today carry the burden of the generation of 1976, because what we've become accustomed to is comparing struggles in South Africa. And when we compare the struggle of 1976, we almost diminish the struggles of young people today, while not acknowledging that we haven't changed the material conditions in which young people exist, and that the struggles of today are still very much relevant, similar to what they were in 1976, because achieving political freedom without the necessary change in economics has meant that the material conditions have not changed. With everything I've just said, I think it's important to also acknowledge that where there has been progress, we must look at what has been the drivers of that progress, because where we see progress, we can amplify that and we can use that as the ability to change what we see today, right? So for example, give you one sector that I think, in spite of its challenges, has shown success for this generation of young people has been higher education. If we look at South Africa today, if we compare what was TEFSA 1992, 1994 to NSFAS today, South Africa produces 4 times the amount of Black graduates than we did in 1994. Faisal's presentation showed the impact of education on social mobility. And indeed, many of us in this room are beneficiaries of the fact that higher education has almost this transformative effect on those on those lives that it is able to impact. Yeah? So if we look at a sector like that, our challenge at the moment is increasing that access to higher education. And sometimes we overcomplicate the matter in saying there's already so much of good work that goes into the sector. And with a few tweaks, supporting greater mental health of young people in higher education, deepening access to finance, increasing access through greater infrastructure in higher education, you can almost use that as a transformative and a catalyzing change to society and a change for young people in South Africa. I think when we talk about the issue of youth unemployment in particular, youth unemployment in South Africa is very structural in nature. So unemployment is not in response to a financial crisis, a COVID crisis. It existed even before these crises. It's not seasonal. It's not when crops are not in season that we have unemployment. We have deep structural issues, both on the supply side and on the demand side. Yeah? And we know economic evidence tells us that to solve structural unemployment, we need more than just minor policy tweaks. We need major reforms if we're going to unlock growth and take millions of people and young people out of unemployment and into employment. Yeah? So my conversation today is going to focus on what we can do now in the immediate so that we change young people, because these structural issues will take time to solve. The crisis in basic education will take time to be able to solve, the luxury of time that today's young people don't necessarily enjoy. But I do believe that there's things we can do immediately now to respond to the crisis, particularly of youth unemployment. Yeah? So the first, I think, is that an acknowledgement within the state that we have a state at the moment that prides itself on being ordinary. And there needs to be this fundamental shift in every public servant, in every leader within the state, that acknowledges that to achieve South Africa's, or wanting to achieve South Africa's democratic gains, we need a state that is willing to be extraordinary in nature. Now, I think this partially comes from the fact that we fear what the implications of our past history are, and we try and paper over these cracks. But I think we know that when we run business, or we run an organization, or even when we run a state, yeah, everything needs to be centered on values. Yeah? And I think bringing back values in the way we define ourselves, values and culture, is important. I don't think that democratically South Africa within the state, and this translates across public schools, higher education institutions, Department of Labor centers, NYDA centers, I don't think we've defined the values that we want to achieve as a country and as a society. And I think redefining the values that we want is the benchmark that can propel us, a redefined cultural appropriation as a country and a society that is driven through our young people. Yeah? Secondly, I think that we must acknowledge and recognize that in this administration, there's been a recognition of the high levels of youth unemployment, right? So the presidency, and I think this is something that is underreported in the media, has made fundamental shifts to redirect policy back into the presidency, particularly youth policy, right? And that culminated in the presidential youth employment intervention, the biggest policy shift in youth employment that has been made in the last 20 years or so, right? So I think there needs to be more critique and more knowledge of the presidential youth employment intervention, so that the efforts being made are, one, acknowledged, two, supported, but 3, designed appropriately. So that where we are investing resources and support, those are directed properly to support transitions of young people. And we're not throwing good money at solutions that are not necessarily going to work. The last suggestion I'm going to make is that the presidential youth employment intervention, while it takes us possibly to the next level or 2 levels up from where we are at the moment, is insufficient to be able to change the trajectory of youth unemployment in South Africa. In order to do that, we need 2 major policy shifts that I think will change the dynamic for our young people in South Africa. One is, I think that a revitalized national youth service program that allows us to channel the energies of our young people into service at scale, but also beyond the economic gains of what it is able to do, changes and channels the energies into social cohesion and nation building together with economic emancipation, has the ability to have a catalytic effect on households, on communities, and on society. The second change I think we need to have is that I think Faisal made an important point in saying that often we see the informal sector as the employer of last resort. In my view, the responsibility as the employer of last resort rests on the state. Yeah? And that in order to address the high levels of youth unemployment in a short space of time, South Africa needs a public employment guarantee that covers at least 50% of unemployed young people. These are not meaningless jobs which young people must do, but it is jobs that have a real material impact on social solidarity and support for South African society. Now, one may say, well, where do these jobs exist? And we have had shifts in employment policy in the past. Predominantly, EPWP was centered on construction, yeah? But there's enough opportunities in social solidarity for us to be able to support a public employment guarantee. For example, as part of the COVID-19 response, last year, 300,000 young people, the majority of them young women, were placed as teachers' assistants and general assistants in public education institutions. Now, if you look at the number, you place 10 young people across 26,000 public schools. That number can easily be scaled to 40 or 50 young people in each school, taking the program from 300,000 to 1.5, 1.6 million young people. And it is not only in public schools, but there is work required to be done in every sector of society where we can create meaningful employment if the state assumes its responsibility as the employer of last resort. That, in addition to the dignity of employment, it has the potential to increase household income. And when you start to increase household incomes, you give households a much better shot at opportunity. We start to see changes, for example, in basic educational outcomes, high educational outcomes, as a result of channeled and increased, deliberate increases in household income. So I would argue today that we need to make these meaningful policy shifts in addition to what is already happening at the moment, because to curb structural unemployment, we need more than just simple solutions or just incremental reform. Thank you very much, David. I'll pause it there.
Okay, thanks. Please, President of SAUS, you are next. Lubabalo, we have a brand new president of the South African Union of Students, who is going to hopefully, brand new as he is, I hope he sticks to his 7 minutes as allocated, because we want to open up more space for discussion and dialogue. It's a dialogue after all. Lubabalo, are you ready? Can you come in and share your perspectives from a student point of view?
Yes, Comrade President, I'm ready, I'm very much ready.
Thank you. You have up to 6:31 or 32.
Okay, thank you, Comrade President. In fact, I think I'll make it less than that so that I serve justice to everyone. I'm going to make it less than that because I think the youth unemployment and unemployment in general in South Africa, it's a known discussion. I don't think we need to discuss further. Comrades do know that there is a need to implement change. But firstly, Chair, I must greet everyone here. I see that there's leadership here of the NCU League. Comrade Nceba is here. I see Comrade Tangi. I see many other comrades, Wasim from NYDA, Fazil from State SA. So I greet everyone. I greet you, Comrade President. Firstly, Comrade President, we are happy that we are invited here as SAUS. We appreciate that there are people that are actually facilitating engagement in terms of youth unemployment in general, but specifically graduate unemployment. So we want to participate and make sure that we make justice in terms of making sure that we bring up about solutions in terms of giving young people employment. Ours is very simple, Comrade President, because we are a student leadership union. So we are going to speak from that perspective, even though we have a view in terms of the general perspective, but we can only show a highlight of that view. But in the main, we're going to focus in the student perspective of this discussion, in fact. Ours as the union, Comrade President, is that we must, in fact, there's a need that we begin to interrogate the relationship between education and employment. When we speak of education, of course, we speak of higher education and employment. The reason that we're raising this is because we have observed that previously, coming from the State SA, of course, this is proven by the State SA, is that as years come by, young people get more unemployed. But on the other side, as years come by, young people get more educated. Now the question is there a symbiotic and a positive relationship between employment and education? Why is it that the more we get educated, the less we get employed? Now we're going to speak in that perspective. I'm happy that Wasim is here because he's the chair of the NYDA, and in the NYDA interviews that took place, many candidates were speaking on the matter. Yeah. So number one, President, when we speak of the education that responds to challenges of unemployment in the country, it is important to understand that, because I'm sure now you have the similar view because you come from this ranks, you have the similar view, and many other comrades in this interview, to say that what is it, what kind of education are we speaking about when we speak of the education that responds directly to the unemployment and other issues that are facing our societies? Why is it that our people are funded by government, they get NSFAS, when they pass their undergraduate qualifications, they are funded by NRF to go to postgrad, but still they can't be employed and they can't respond to challenges of young people in this country? Firstly, Comrade President, we want to raise the fact that the level of our curriculum content in which we teach in our education needs to be reviewed and needs to be understood better, because it has shown that there is no positive response in terms of employment and our education. If we had listened to interviews of NYDA Comrade President, some few candidates, I think part of those candidates, Comrade Petro and other comrades, who spoke on general the economic system of the country that does not allow industries that are labor intensive to open for employment, and particularly youth employment. Comrades were speaking about the deindustrialization of the country in itself finding itself having to deindustrialize and close out spaces where there's high level of employment that should be created. Now, when we speak of this, President, we want to speak of it as a student leadership from a student perspective. When we speak of student leadership, we question two things when it comes to employment and youth employment in general. To say, how is it that the country seeks to drive youth employment, but drive it through private ownership? For an example, as the country, we are at the space where, one, there's nothing by the way doing good. We can't fund a free education sustainable if we believe that education is responding to employment. We can't even fund. Two, the model that we have designed under NYDA Combat Wasim, that seeks to create young people as employers of other people in South Africa, is not really a solution. What do I mean? NYDA, as we're speaking, is at the point where they are giving out 10,000, 2,000, 15,000, probably maximum is 100,000 to young people. I'm not sure, as a response to their unemployment and as a plan to develop their business systems. Our government does not seek to invest in one solution to say this is the solution that we're going to use in terms of dealing with unemployment in general and youth unemployment to be particular. Now, we are because young people find frustration. Even if you take them to higher institutions, they do go to higher education levels, they acquire those qualifications. But the financial sector is closed for young people to be able to start any new ideas. By the way, I'm sure NYDA will tell you that every month, young people are submitting ideas that they need funding for. But the financial sector...
Mr. President, you are left with a minute.
Okay, I'm going to summarize the ship. The financial sector is closed out to young people such that they can't even be able to get funding out of it. So there are many issues, President, because in the interview, in the presentation I'm listening to, and that was presented by Wasim, saying that only 9.3% of educated people are not unemployed. The understanding is that even the 9.3 is not a true reflection because there are young people who are educated who live from one internship to another. They are not really employed, they're not really in business, but they live from one internship to another. They get paid 2,000, 3,000 for their own survival. Now the country needs to begin to invest in industrialization, invest in education that actually responds to our challenges. What we refer to as the union as the free education, an education that does not only create employees, but an education that creates employers. Thank you, Comrade President.
Thank you very much. Who comes in now? Luyolo, are you ready? If I may, Luyolo is the Democratic Alliance youth leader. He's also a member of parliament. I think is actively watching with keen interest the recent interviews of the National Youth Development Agency. And I think we really should appreciate his presence and contribution tonight. We are asking the question, I must say again, the state of youth in South Africa is South Africa marking time. Thanks, Luyolo, up to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and a very good evening to everybody on the Zoom call. I think it's vitally important. I do have 7 minutes, but I'm so excited to see so many fellow young people, fellow leaders and colleagues that I do engage with a lot of the time, as well as to see Pearl, who's also here after our time in Cape Town for the NYDA interviews. Great to be with everybody tonight. I think one thing I'd like to say is to really just appreciate the space to be able to have this dialogue. I think many times, we are invited to spaces as young people, and it's phrased as a debate, which in time already provides and gives division amongst the ideas that we may have for the issues and the problems that we have in this country. And so I appreciate the fact that this particular space is a dialogue where, as young people, we can have these engagements and share those ideas, but not only share ideas, but actually find practical ways in which we can really bring those ideas for the benefit of young people in the country. And so there's just a number of things I'd really like to speak to that I really believe are things that we need to consider in trying to shape this agenda, and also trying to really understand what do we want and how do we get it, looking at the issues that have been presented by Mohammed from Stats SA, and we looking at the numbers that we've seen that are really alarming and shocking. But I think the first point of call for me really is how do we reimagine the policy space in which young people have not necessarily been as involved as they should. And that is a question of lack of public participation, or lack of the ability to really meet young people where they are and engage them where they are, without the assumption that we know what they want and how that should be articulated in terms of policy. And so I think the first couple of things that I think are very important at this particular juncture that we find ourselves with high levels of youth unemployment. We've already heard the stats around graduates who are currently unemployed, unable to find jobs, the struggle for entrepreneurs, particularly young ones in the space, trying to make sure that their business survive. And so I do think that the policy space is one of the most important things for us to use as a first point of departure. And so right now, we as young people are faced with the amendment of the NYDA Act of 2008. And I think this policy is one of the most important things that we really should be engaged in as young people, because a lot of us may have problems with the NYDA and have problems with how the NYDA in the past has been able to speak to the challenges that young people are facing, and as to what role it should be playing in this generation and in assisting this generation to really find its full potential. And I do believe that, you know, we are presented with an option to be able to engage this policy as it's being amended, and to be able to say what we want the NYDA to look like for us, and how we want it to serve us, and how we want it to actually start having a really formidable role in this economy, and also driving the youth agenda, particularly with the interface that it has with various government departments, both national and international stakeholders. There is a role that this institution needs to play, and we need to move it forward so that it does capture the ideas that young people have and actually brings them into manifestation. And so I think that is the first part, where we have to look at how exactly do we streamline the NYDA to speak to these issues. The other thing that I think has been very interesting has been how we got to the National Youth Policy that we now have till 2030. And you know, there's been a lot of conversation about how this particular policy this time around is going to be impactful and meaningful, particularly to young people. It is a guiding document. It is a document that is essentially mapping out what the youth agenda is supposed to be, but who exactly contributed to it, who was involved in it, who drafted it. And those are the type of questions I think we really need to start thinking about in ways in which we reimagine the public policy space, but also how we engage young people, particularly when it comes to issues that are about them. And so I think I would not do justice if I did not speak about the work that is currently being done by the notorious Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. I think whenever I listen to any conversation, there's nothing ever positive that really young people have to say about a department that is envisioned to really speak to the challenges that young people are facing, and is essentially a monitoring and evaluation department looking at other departments of whether or not they are implementing programs that are uplifting young people and are able to take young people out of the crises that we are facing in this country. And so I think the work that happens there really is demanding of us as a generation to have a conversation of the relevance of such a department. And if it is, how do we actually look at the strategic objectives ground who are actually looking for answers, who are actually looking to know exactly where we are going as a country. And so I think there are really great moments in which, you know, where we have spaces for collaboration, whether it be with civil society or NGOs, but those spaces of collaboration need to be emphasized more than what they are right now. And so I really believe in moments that collaborations have been able to be successful, there has been moments we have been able to for example, extend the NYD amendment public comment process so that more young people have the opportunity to engage the document and give their views. The same thing happened with the National Youth Policy. Those opportunities really are important for us to collaborate across political lines, across civil society organizations, etc., because the mission is not different. You know, we sit a lot in these things with Undo, Unongeba, and many other people, Pearl, a lot of the people that are here. And when you listen to the conversations, it's never so material in terms of whether it's substantive or not. It's similar, you know, so we need to just use the tools around us and be able to strive together with a plan that we can be able to use. Just the last point that I'd like to add is just in terms of being able, I don't know if my time is up.
No, 1 minute, 1 minute.
Oh, all right. Just quickly, the last thing is just, I think with the youth unemployment crisis now, I think there has to be an aggressive approach in terms of looking for sectors that we believe may give a lot of young people space, you know, for job creation and space to innovate. I don't think we have been intentional about finding those spaces, whether it be the blue economy, the oceans, you know, all these different sectors that are really booming across the world, the tech world. I think we need to be intentional about cultivating those spaces and also looking at the problem of unemployment, as Wasim was saying, from a structural point of view, because the issue is about skills. It is about skills speaking to the current economic space that we find ourselves as young people. And so if we are not able to have that understanding of where we want to go and start to reimagine the work that needs to be done in a way that it hasn't. And I think COVID presents the perfect opportunity for us to have those reforms that actually work for young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luyolo. Luyolo is, as I said, a DA youth leader. Nongceba, please come through. I think this is your chance, and then after that we'll have Pearl Pillay who's going to respond to everybody, and then we then open it up for conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Comrade David, and good afternoon good evening to everyone who's here, especially the young people who have joined us on this last day of Youth Month. I think I just want to start as a start, and I think that it's easy for us to function on the assumption that we all know what the concept of youth is about. And I just want to spend a few minutes unpacking that. Africa's policy, public policy conceptions tells us that very, concretely that when you speak about youth, you speak about people who are between the ages of 14 and 35. Our own constitution as the Youth League and that of the African National Congress as well defines it such. So in this sense, and in the context of this evening's discussion, when we ponder about the state of youth, we are essentially, pondering about the state of those who are between a particular bracket, which is the bracket of 14 and 35. And I think I want to propose that we start by explaining the rationale behind us having those social brackets that we call youth and how it relates to everything else in society. And I think additionally, that explanation will help us to locate the state of youth discussion in the overall context of the state of our society in general. So really, as the Youth League, I think we want to start remarks about the conceptual framework around youth formation as a social process in relation to society. And I think later on we'll also give some broad outlines of what we think should be done politically and socially to dramatically transform the state of affairs for young people for the better. So very briefly, the concept of youth is about transitional dynamics. And really by this, we mean that when one refers, it refers to a process of transitioning between childhood and adulthood. In more political terms, it means that transitioning from a social dependence to social independence. So put differently, the concept of youth proceeds from the understanding that a social existence is split into two. And I think we've said it, which is childhood and adulthood. Childhood being marked by the absolute dependence on other social actors for one's economic, social, cultural, as well as political sustenance. And adulthood meaning the opposite, that it's someone who's self-sustaining in terms of their autonomy, and how they engage with life at an economic level, at a political level, cultural level, as well as an intellectual level as their own agents. So therefore, if we are to speak about or reflect about the state of youth, we are really reflecting about a particular grouping in society that we define as people who have the autonomy to engage politically, economically, socially, culturally, and intellectually as their own agents. And we have to ask ourselves, does the grouping that we refer to between the ages of 14 and 35 have that sort of agency or that opportunity to engage in those spheres of society at that particular level? And I think that the presentation that we've received from Stats SA gives a very clear picture that if we are to use that definition, then the state of youth and how we've defined it would not fit into what is currently happening on the ground. And I won't repeat what other speakers have said in terms of the problems that we face. And I think we'll just go into what we think needs to be done to change the very devastating state of youth in South Africa. So a lot of political and ideological proposals have been shared in this country, especially over the last 12 to 15 years. And as the ANC Youth League, I want to focus on particularly what we've deposited into the public domain under some resolutions that were adopted at our last conference of the Youth League, themed under the theme which says economic freedom in our lifetime, where young people came together and identified 7 pillars that we said that we believe could drastically change the state of youth in South Africa. And I'm just going to focus on 2 because I only have 7 minutes. The first one being transforming the commanding heights of the economy. And I think other speakers have touched on it, as well as our colleague from Stats SA, and really, as the figures also shown, that finance capital is in effect the most strategic commanding height of the economy. I think the number in the slide that we saw was actually 20%. And it is a fact that all economic activity, production, exchange, consumption, etc., are all enabled by the financial sector of our economy. National savings and national capital formation depend largely on the financial sector in both your banking sector as well as your insurance sector. So we really need to start making deliberate inroads in the sector and vigorously campaign to have the state support efforts of young people in this regard. Recently, the historic call that young people made for the creation of a state bank and the repurposing of the mandate of the Reserve Bank, including its nationalization, have obviously become ANC resolutions. However, as the Youth League, I think we must insist that we need to vigilantly give substance to these resolutions in the interest of young people. As an example, the necessary transformation of the Reserve Bank should not just be about nationalizing its ownership, but critically, we must repurpose its mandate to go beyond price stability, but also include unemployment targeting as a basis for its monetary stance that supports industrialization. Additional to that, there's also a need for us to really build a common youth campaign for the reimagination of our development finance institutions. The mandates of your PICs, your IDCs, your NEF and other public finance institutions have really been left without, critical consideration. In fact, if you look at the trends, some can argue that there's really an elite capture of these institutions and lack of public accountability in their funding mechanisms. We continue to see some already well-empowered enterprises and companies and persons benefiting from these institutions, while youth-owned businesses and ventures fail as a result of lack of support. I think other colleagues or comrades have touched on the NYDA and its purpose and how maybe we need to give more support to the NYDA to be able to fill this gap that we've identified with your other development finance institutions. Additionally, we must also campaign for a high impact industrialization strategy that can anchor district development. Industrialization, and I think again it came up in the presentations of the other comrades, is the most strategic program of development, employment creation and achieving real economic growth. Tied to this perspective must be the use of minerals and finance capital currently concentrated in the northern region of the country, which is your Gauteng, your Northwest, your Limpopo, and your Mpumalanga, to provide a lifeline for industrial development in other regions of the country. And of course, local beneficiation becomes very critical in this regard. Furthermore, we'll also have to really, think strategically about the mandate of our state-owned enterprises. We have not invested much work in reimagining the investment strategies of these SOEs. As holders of public investment capital, together with the DFIs we've mentioned above, there's a great
Nongaba, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, I'll just finish off and I'll leave the other part. There's a greater industrial development investment scope that our SOE should be playing in leading industrial development across the country and building market linkages for young people. I think the issue of COVID-19 and innovation and access to digitization has been dealt with by Luyolo, but I think most importantly, we mustn't forget the importance of the price of data and that particular struggle that we have to take up as young people. And my very last point is that as youth formations, we need better organization. As Yolo said, there are no fundamental differences in how, in fact, there might be ideological differences, but we do have to organize better as youth formations in the interest of addressing the youth crisis in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, National Convener of the ANC Youth League. I actually made a mistake by not introducing you properly. I'm sorry about that. The next speaker really is the one responding and really closing up this panel, and then we open it up. It's now actually 6:53, so she's got about 5 to 7 minutes. And really it's to close it up and respond to some of the ideas and suggestions and questions. And so that really we have that. I mean, Pearl Pillay is a well-known long-time youth development activist, and she is running the Youth Lab, as some of you may know. And basically she's also going for the NYDA interview, which I just learned about it as Luyolo was actually talking here. I wasn't aware that one of our associates is actually going for the NYDA. So I must put a disclaimer that this is not a promotion or a lobby initiative for her, but Pearl is really a seasoned youth development practitioner and a thinker in the space. Pearl, take over.
Thank you so much, David. I was going to say, you must be on the pulse of what the young people are doing, and you'll know about the things. But thank you for convening the space and the conversation. And I see there's a large number of people in the room today. So thank you, especially to the young people that decided on a Wednesday evening that this is where you wanted to be. Mine is actually a very simple task, and it is to respond to some of the inputs that have been made throughout this panel. I've been given 5 minutes, and I know David's been very strict with time, so I'm not going to break any of the rules here today. But I think what we've seen through our conversation for me is 3 main inputs that I think underpin what all of us have been saying in different ways. The first is about the way that we understand youth. And I think we had it right at the beginning with Faisal, and Wasim spoke a lot about it as well, about the idea of youth as a transition, right? When we think about being young in South Africa, we understand that being a young person, you can't point to one thing and say, this is the thing that makes you young, I guess, other than age, right? All of the ways that we experience being young is through the different transitions that occur in our lives. So for example, you move from high school to university. That's an educational transition, but it might also be a geographical one. For many people, it's obviously an economic one. You move through different phases through varsity, even if you don't go to tertiary education, right? And you move into employment, moving away from your parents' home, forming interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships. Those are what we call social transitions. And all of those things underpin what it means to be youth, right? And so for me, the guiding question around youth development particularly is, what are the ways in which development work responds to the different transitions that young people face and that young people encounter? And I think we see the gaps in misunderstanding these transitions very strongly when you look at just the university space. I'm really glad that we have the new president of SAUS here today. Greetings, congratulations, and I hope that you'll do well in your term. But I think we see it in education where we go into the university space and it's such a big culture shock. It's such a multi-layered experience because we're managing so many transitions at the same time. And the way in which tertiary education is structured doesn't allow you to manage those transitions effectively. And it only expects you to focus on, for example, your academics, right? And so when you're now having to figure out a geographic transition, you've moved away from home to a new province, you are probably living by yourself for the first time. For most people, you can't actually afford fees. And so you're either looking for NSFAS or other funding options, or you don't have funding options at all. You may not actually have housing. There's all of those different transitions you're making that purely expecting you to focus on just the academic part of education is part of the reason why so many students struggle. And so for me, that's the key guiding question around how we look at development, and particularly youth development, is what are the different transitions that young people have to move through, and how does our development work respond to that? The last two things, as I can see, I only have like 2 minutes left. Is spaces, identifying spaces of collaboration. Like David mentioned, I run an organization called Youth Lab, and we have formed a very, what I think will be a long-lasting relationship with an organization called Youth Capital. What we've done is realized that we both come with a very specific set of skills and resources. And what we talk about this a lot, right? Everyone says, oh, we work in silos and we don't actually collaborate with each other. And so what we've done is realize that the commonality that we share is our interest in policy. And so we have a policy working group that we run on WhatsApp that has over 150 young people in it that raise policy issues that are important to them. And they make submissions and they do capacity workshops and they help each other through their own developmental journeys. But it's allowed two organizations to come together and do some really cool work in a space that's often neglected by civil society organizations. And that's really, I think, where the treasure trove of like good development work sits, is the idea that, like I think Wasim had said earlier, that this is a values conversation. So the idea that there are organizations that share the same values and the same developmental vision makes it really easy to work together, but it also means that your work can go further and your work can have more meaning and more impact. And so what are the ways in which we're able to collaborate with each other? And this also happens outside of government, right? So what I really enjoy about the youth development space particularly is that it is so full of young activists, young development practitioners, young organizations, and just general young people who are interested in working together and solving some of the issues that we have. And that kind of work can happen outside of government. And so I would implore us here as a group today to think about the ways in which we use collaboration in our work. I think the policy space is a really good example of how you can bring together people that have a range of different expertise around a common goal and the kind of work that you can produce from it. The last point I'll make is around what I call policy synergy, right? And speakers throughout the panel have talked about the different policy options and interventions we have, but we've not spent a lot of time thinking about how all our policy talks to each other. So we talked about the PYEI a little bit at the beginning, and I think the PYEI is a really great first step in addressing the unemployment issue in a way that really considers what the problem is. But we need to be able to look at how does the PYEI speak to the integrated youth development strategy of the NYDA? How does it speak to the national youth policy of the department, right? How does it feed into what we want the National Youth Service to look like? And how do all of those things work together to create real policy intervention?
Pearl, you know what I'm going to say. Yeah.
I've got you, don't worry.
Okay, thanks, really. Thanks, Pearl. I think most of the things will be raised in the question and answer session. I think really, I must thank all the panelists from their diverse backgrounds, exposure and experience. Their insights, knowledge of youth issues have been very invaluable in this conversation. I must say that as the policy space, we have made a public commitment when we launched in February that we're going to try and have these types of dialogues, which we call Lekgotla, at least once a quarter. And this is our second one because we started off with migration in March, and now we're here. But really, I think what is critical here is that all of us are looking at the way out of this current situation. So we have about 30 minutes because exactly at, in fact, we have about 20 minutes because 20 minutes for comments and questions, because I need to allow my panel to wrap up in the last 10 minutes. So we're going to allow questions, comments. You can ask any question as robust as you can, but remain considerate and respectful. That's the type of platform we have here at the policy space. And we really appreciate your presence here. So I'm going to take, I think I see the first hand is Amuzweni Ngoma. Will you please shoot? Will be followed by Desmond, and after that it will be Twarelo Matebula. As you know, you have 90 seconds. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, thanks so much, David. Look, I'm not going to say a lot, but I'm very grateful for the discussion because I think it is extremely rich, and that perhaps beyond this particular conversation, there are things that we need to mine because there are lots of diamonds there. The thing that I want to say, and to just push through the conversation as fast as possible to a place where we're talking about resolutions and what we do. I'm not at all a young person, right? But I do think that the presentation made by Faisal was extremely thrilling and revealing, and that Wasim and I think the president of SOS, I think you said, was also illuminating. I do think that Wasim, after Faisal spoke, specifically said that the missing element, right, in our policy debate is the extent to which we have actually taken youth service very seriously. It is obvious from Faisal's numeric illumination that young people are not necessarily captured by education and training institutions, and that a lot of them then fall through and become part of the NEET category, right? And I think implicitly Wasim hit it on he really got to the nub of it when he spoke about whether or not National Youth Service is a policy imperative across the state. And if implicit also in his own questioning and questioning about how it is that we end up with structural unemployment of young people, is that what has the state itself actually done and responded to in terms of being the employer of last resort, and not necessarily, talking about the informal sector. I think then, you also spoke about the discourse that happened around the late 90s when, David, when you spoke about the lost generation. Part of that discourse, right, was to speak about what kind of policy imperatives must we pick up, right? And part of that discourse in the last 25 years has been the falling through the cracks of National Youth Service, right, as the last employer of resort for young people. And so if implicit in everything that has been said by the panelists, right, about a compact that is necessary for young people and youth development and actually unlocking the potential of this economy, right, is that what do we say about National Youth Service as the last kind of space and resort for youth employment, right? Because
Thank you.
I mean,
Thank you, Amazon.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Okay, okay, yes. Please try to be a bit concise, because I think I hate actually to cut people, because I think all of us are more or less familiar with the key issues and the key questions facing the youth. So if you can just go direct and just go to the meat of it, and then yeah, that would be good. Desmond.
Thank you, David. Evening, everyone who's in the room. My name is Desmond Mohotlani, a digital transformation specialist and an activist. I'll try to be brief and avoid the preamble like you want, David. Looking at the stats that were presented, it would seem that the apartheid government managed to turn the Black youth into unskilled laborers, exploited mainly in mines during the gold rush. But then when we move to the current government, it seems that the current government from the states have sent young people to the streets to basically suffer there in hunger. Shocking stats, to be honest. Now, the question is, how do we change this? It would seem that the South African youth should stop politicking. I think we have enough young people who are politicking already. I'm one of them. And maybe that is why we do then have age cheats so that people can participate in youth politics. I think that needs to be reduced. We need to have young people who will then pick a skills sector to focus on and maybe attain a skills revolution instead of other revolutions that we do know about. By the skills revolution, I'm talking about the one that happened in India that turned India into a leading information technology resource provider. Now, if you look at the stats globally and you go into the market currently and you're looking for information technology skills, chances are in the top 10, you'll find that you have enough skills in India to provide the whole world with those type of skills. I think as a country and as a continent, that's basically what we need to make sure that we change the state of affairs that we see now, David. So I just want to keep it there so that I don't ruin it. Thanks, man.
I note that there's some very so let me just allow Sorelo come in before I make my comment at the end of the questions. Come in.
Okay, thanks, convener. And very, very briefly, I want to pose two questions and maybe on the third one, maybe provide a comment. The first one is, maybe we might want to look at where the gap is in our education system, because we are educating young people, but these young people end up unemployed. So it means that there is a deficiency in our education system to the extent that it's unable to equip its graduates to make a living if they cannot find a job. To what extent is the curriculum that we teach at our schools, at our universities, speak to such issues, for instance, as enterprise development, as personal finance, understanding the various machinations of the market in order to tackle employment. That gap is quite glaring. What you see is a traditional education system where we teach people so that they can go out and look for jobs in the market without necessarily providing them with the requisite skills to be able to think creatively and come up with the market themselves. I want to make a contrast between the generally informal labor force of South Africans compared to migrants that comes to the country, be they Zimbabweans, be they Nigerians, and so on and so forth. You'd realize that a huge majority of them are equipped with practical skills. They own beauty spas, they own salons, they own restaurants, they do tailoring, and many other jobs which, if we can be able to look at those particular skills critically and ensure that we are able to equip our young people to be able to have those practical skills, I think that to a certain extent, we might be able to address these issues of youth unemployment. With those few things, I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mapolisa.
Thank you, David. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'll be quick, my brother. David, I thank you so much. And the panel, please, let's start by changing this definition of youth, of 14 to 35. Because immediately a youth graduated the age of 21. That individual, by that time, between that age of 21 to 35, is 14 years. David. The individual becomes desensitized about unemployment because he is hoping that he's still youth, there's still an opportunity for him to actually get an employment. I think I've pushed that agenda even on National Planning Commission that we really have to change that. I think NYDA with our ANC Youth League, they must fight for this so that we change it. I mean, in that period of other countries are doing that, David. In that period of 14 years, compared to an individual who is still waiting for employment, compared with other individuals internationally who are already employed by that time and doing something else because they're not considering themselves youth but adults. What kind of competency would a South African youth would have acquired by that time? So they are so far lagging behind in that regard. So in the issue of access to finance, this issue of access to finance, which I think the financial sector has to be transformed. I think Lubabalo spoke on this matter because you find that the issue that is actually was presented by Faisal, where you find that white and Indians are actually progressing in terms of skill development as compared to colored and black, is because the colors and blacks do not have access even to finance their education, and they can't even be able to acquire employment thereafter. So those are the things that we really have to really change and make sure that the banks are really allowing our youth, to be financed in terms of education as well as when they establish the small businesses as well. We also have to restructure our development financing. Nonabo talked about this thing. They have to change their model. I mean, they are using the very same model that the banks are using. The same interest, the same rating, the same everything. There is no difference. They are actually banks. They are just masquerading as state institutions. I disagree with Wasim on the issue of National Youth Service. That thing is not gonna work. I can agree with him in the fact that it's gonna work in terms of engaging youth to stay away from crime and other illicit activities, but not in terms of skilling. You need youth who are equipped and having skills that they come back and compete into the competent sector of the economy, that they can be therefore be followed and be chased by employers to come and work into their companies, not youth service development. I disagree. The last one, my chief, I think just to get out of it, there are sectors. I mean, one of the persons spoke about the issue of sectors that are low hanging for young people. For example, the circular economy, where you deal with the waste management. We really have to make sectors like those sexy and fancy for young people to engage into, as well as the sector of the Korea subsector, where now is dominated by foreigners. Foreigners are actually owning that scooter Korea, delivering even now for checkers all over. You find no South African there. All of them are foreigners. Those are sectors that we should identify, David, and push our young people. And then I urge our ANCU Youth League, the DA Youth League, as well as NYDA, they must change their approach. They must push this agenda. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Mapolisa. Tebogo, I know you will be business-like. I've always known you to be like that.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is maybe twofold. The first is, it seems as though, tactically we are discussing policy and it makes sense. I struggle to find where the common vision statement for this country actually lies. I'd be curious to find out what people actually see to be this vision. If we're transitioning as the youth to somewhere, where is that end state? And the second point, and my final point, is competitive advantage. If you look at other nations, people have talked about India, Singapore, China, the US, they've identified their national competitive or comparative advantage. And yet it still seems as though we are struggling to look at it based on whether it's our economic or geographical positioning in order to tap into that to really start to compete in the world. I'd be curious to understand from the panelists where they think our comparative advantage could be and how we can align our policies, our energy, and the investment in education to align to that comparative advantage. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, that was nice and short and sweet. Rita, you want to come in?
Oh, thank you so much, Chair. I'm not a young person. I'm someone in business. I've been in business for close to 19 years, if not more than 19 years. I've got two comments that I just want to make. The first thing is, I'm missing someone who can relate the message between young people, parents, and the TVET colleges in relation to society understanding that a young person doesn't need matric to go to higher education. That's why even when you apply, the requirement will be equivalence of level 4. Because we find young people going through the whole system. By the time they get to matric, they go to the lower level of the course that they're doing because they're going to TVET college. It's wasting their time, it's wasting their productivity and their contribution to the economy. That's one message that even when I move around my family members, I don't find society understanding the national qualification system, how it works between an academic learner that goes to matric and a non-academic learner that goes to vocational education. That's number one. Number two, as I said, I'm a small business owner. I've been doing this for 19 years. One of the things that we are battling with is managing our growth in terms of paying labor. If you can go to any SMME, they can take one youth. And what I've learned with all the SMMEs is that they struggle with finance, they struggle with administration. Now, if you can look into the country, I work with SMMEs. We try to assist them to find this internship, and most of them, they result in permanent employment. Because if I have a young person for 2 years who contribute economically, at the end of it is that in that 2 years, I've worked to a process whereby when the internship comes to an end, I'm able to employ that person. These are the two issues that I think young people and the NYDA, your organization, they need to make sure that they pay attention to these issues. SMMEs are not involved in the discussion of assisting the unemployed young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the next person is, let me get I think it's Asanda.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening to your speakers. I think for the sake of time, I'll just
Yes.
straight into my comments. I've got quite a long comment, but I'll try to stick within the time frame. Chair, I think firstly, thank you. I think the presentations were very insightful. The point that was raised by Pearl on the fact that young people are not a homogeneous group and that we do need interventions that respond to the different developmental needs of young people is an important point. The second point that I wanted to raise, Chair, is the fact that we need enforcement of current policies. For instance, we've got your 30% set asides for youth and women procurement. But this is a hardened rule in government, but it's not properly enforced and monitored according to your regulation 9 of the Treasury Relations. Now we need your institutions such or your agencies such as your sorry, Chair, I think someone's hijacking my comment now.
Okay, guys, can we mute other guys? Sipo, please, let's mute everybody else. They tend to forget, please.
No, that's me. I'm not alone here, Chair.
Oh, sorry, Asanda.
Yes,
we have to accommodate that. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. But Chair, as I was saying, an agency such as your NYDA should be at the forefront of developing like your M&E tracking mechanisms with your national and your provincial treasuries, so that to ensure that, for instance, where or rather to ensure compliance, and where there isn't, the question then begs, what becomes the consequence management to such transgressors that don't enforce this 30% set aside? And then on the state of SMMEs, Chair, it is said that that sector or that space could be one that can really be used to propel employment. But currently, as things stand, I think there's about 28% of SMMEs that contribute towards the total workforce. And of that, you've got a small percentage that are occupied by young people. Now, there was a study that was conducted by your Standard Bank Small Business Unit that stated that about 60% of the reasons why SMME survived was work experience. So one of the areas that we could look into is to ensure that how do we use such data that is available to ensure that SMMEs don't fail, Chair. And then lastly, the issue of for me, I believe that a more impactful solution for youth unemployment is job creation schemes such as your EPWP. Now you had, after your World War II, your New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, where that under that administration, there was a real focus on intensive sectors such as your housing and roads and so on. So I think for me, that should be the place or the sector that young people play in, and that could really change the trajectory that we find ourselves in. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Asanda. Clayton and Lulu, please try to stick to 1 minute. I've got some of the panelists leaving. So Clayton will start first, 1 minute strictly, and Lulu as well, 1 minute strictly. And then we will allow Nonweba from the Youth League to respond first, and then the rest of the panelists will follow. Thanks.
Thank you. Very quickly.
We've lost your audio, Clayton.
Yes, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, wonderful. Just 2 comments. The first comment is, I think the more I listen to some of these debates, the more worried I get that our conceptualization of youth development is becoming narrower and narrower, and is tending to focus a lot only on employment, skills development, business development, etc. The concept of youth development is broader than that. And we shouldn't try to minimize it. We should rather try to maximize it. Understanding that in the context that we find ourselves in today and what the stats and the evidence is presenting, that focus should go on education, focus should go on employment, focus should go on skills development. But let us not lose the broader notion of youth development. and we may be missing out on some key areas with regards to youth, social development, democracy development, mental health, etc., etc. And a lot of those issues don't feature in some of the discussions and the debates around youth development. And my fear is that if we continue along these lines and don't recorrect sometimes, we could be doing a disservice to the broader agenda of youth development. Thank you.
Lulu, come through.
Thank you, Chair. I am an avid believer that policy speaks and subsequently is very tactile and agile. South Africa has a proven and a very eager history of policy development with a poor track record of evaluation and management. Hindsight is important. Simultaneously, it is also very costly if it's the only component that we rely on where learning is concerned. The policy is there. Have we acutely identified the gaps? Do we fully understand them? And to what extent is education literacy a factor to grassroots enrollment programs, particularly for those youth who live outside the economic hub? To conclude, Chair, my comments, grander ideas keep us excited, but I believe it is the technical small corrective measures that keep us in line in pursuit of our national agendas and objectives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lulu. Thank you all for the comments and the questions, the suggestions, and all the beautiful ideas you've put forward. I think this is exactly what we require. So I'll ask Nongceba to basically, everybody now, the panelists have 2 minutes each to make their concluding remarks, and then we conclude the session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David, Comrade David, and thank you to all the inputs. They've really been great, and thank you for allowing me to go first because I do have another engagement starting in exactly 4 minutes. I think one, Clayton makes a very, very important point, and I think it's linked to the point that was made by the first speaker, linked to one. Yes, it is true that we do tend to have narrowed our discussions around youth development, and I think an important aspect of that, and I think which is why I actually agree with Wasim around the, because beyond the issue of the National Youth Service, you also have how we really have neglected the importance of sports, arts, and culture in youth development. When we were growing up, we had programs like your Love Life programs, your BASA programs, and a whole lot of sports and arts and cultural programs that are so crucial in keeping young people off the streets. And we've really seen disinvestment in those sectors, and we've really seen them disappear, especially in our townships and our rural areas. And as a result of that, you have a high, you have young people going into crime. We really have young people becoming destitute because we really have disinvested in the other more social aspect of youth empowerment and youth development that is so crucial in the development of a young person. I do think that will come back. Asanda spoke about enforcement of existing policies. And I think the one that the Youth League and other youth formations, I think the NYDA as well with the previous board, were very instrumental in advocating for was the scrapping of experience for entry-level work in government. And we really need to follow up on that because that is something that young people advocated for, but we actually don't see the implementation of that in government. I think it was Mapulisa who spoke about the definition of youth. And I think what we have to do as the Youth League and other youth formations is really to, in us defining youth and the bracket in terms of age, but perhaps we do need to rethink, because it is correct that the problems faced by a 20-year-old young person are different from the problems faced by a 30-year-old young person, and the problems faced by a 31-year-old problems faced by a 35-year-old. And so I think really we need to, and in fact, South Africa's definition of youth is actually not in line with what the world definition is, because the world definition, I think, is much lower than the 35 that we have in South Africa. So maybe we do need to have that discussion. And I think it's a discussion that the youth thing also needs to take forward. And lastly, I just want to touch on what Rita talked about, as well as Tshwarelo, with regards to the issue, one, of skills, and two, the issue of TVET colleges. And I think it was Tshwarelo who spoke about the fact that you have so many young people with existing skills. But our problem also is that, what do we do with the young people who have existing skills? Because in every township, for an example, in South Africa, you will find a young person, I always say this, who actually knows how to lay a brick. But that young person cannot build my house in Pretoria East because they're not accredited for the skills that they have. So in order to get that young person in Mamelodi who knows how to lay a brick to be able to be contracted by Nongeba, who lives in Pretoria, they would need to be accredited. And I do think that the lack of accreditation of existing skills of young people, we are really doing them a disservice in terms of youth empowerment. And I think I'll pause there with my closing comments. And thank you very much for a great discussion.
Thank you, Nongeba. Can we please ask Faisal again, 2 minutes each, guys, and then I'll do the concluding remarks. Faisal, if you can start.
Okay, hopefully my mic is working this time. I just want to say that I'm really inspired by the conversations and the ideas that come off. Statistics is looking in the rear view mirror. We're looking what's left behind, and we try to sometimes spotlight those that are left behind. And I don't think the youth or the adults or the children, we look at this holistic, but the ideas that come off is looking forward. And as a statistical organization, we don't talk about what's looking forward, but I'm glad that we provided the platform in terms of giving you some sort of context to the issues that are facing our nation at present. Thank you to all the colleagues, to all the speakers. It was really enlightful and insightful. Thank you.
Mr. CEO, are you still with us?
I'm still with you, Chair. Thanks very much. I think I just want to make 2 quick points. So one, I think there needs to be some level of accountability. These are important spaces for discussion, but work is ongoing on a daily basis, and I think accountability is important. So towards the end of the year, the NYDA is the primary government institution for youth development, will convene the youth sector at the intersection of the economy, education, social development, and then particularly employment as well, so that there's accountability on commitments that have been made in the National Youth Policy and the Integrated Youth Development Strategy. So one, I think that meeting of the minds is there, but I also want to suggest, Comrade Chairperson, that we reconvene this session 6 months from now, and maybe after the third quarter's quarterly labor force survey. The NYD will support that process, and that we give accountability back to the colleagues that have been here today around the interventions that have been made. As I've said, I feel that there's policy shifts which are happening, and it's important that we don't wait 5 years before we assess those policy shifts. Yeah? So I give my word that I'm happy to come back to the session 6 months from now and account on what has been done and whether those interventions are shifting the needle on youth development in South Africa. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Wasim. I think Lubabalo, are you still here? Lubabalo from the South African Union of Students. I think he did indicate that he's got some connection problems, so we'll have to skip him. So can I have Mr. Mpiti? Luyolo?
Thank you very much, David, for the platform and for us to have such great conversations. I wish we could really get into some of the questions and answer them. But I think what I will say is just to speak to one question, which was, what is the vision of this generation? I think that's a vision that still needs to be crafted, but I think what's more urgent for us right now as young people is to answer these questions. How are we going to deal with the youth unemployment rate? How are we going to deal with the mental health challenge that young people are facing in the country right now? How are we going to deal with young people who are entrepreneurs or in the business space? And so I think that is a very good place to start that conversation and be able to move from there. I also just want to say that I think instead of prioritizing funding and grants for young people, which are vitally important in the development of business and entrepreneurship, we should also prioritize market linkages. Because sometimes, it's just a matter of a network and a place in which a young person can really put their idea forward and really have that space thrive in receiving that particular idea. And so I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do, but I want to say that, as part of the team that is part of the portfolio of women, youth, and persons with disabilities, I have worked with many people on this call on different issues that they wanted to push, whether it was a policy idea or in ways in which they believed that we could do more in a particular space. And I'm open to continue to do that. And if there is an invitation to come back, I really would like to do that. But thank you very much for the space. It's been great.
Thanks, Luyolo. Pam, do you want to make your concluding remarks and responses?
Yes, thanks. 2 minutes. So for me, I think my closing remarks will really be to push us all to think about why we think about youth the way we do in South Africa. So we've had the age conversation a little bit today, but so the UN defines young youth as 15 to 24. The African Union uses 14 to 35. And I think that already shows us where the thinking sits, right? And that's really the only point I want to make as my closing remarks, is that there's a reason in which we have to think about young people and what it means to be young differently. If we think about colonization, we think about apartheid, we think about all of the historic things that has made being young difficult. It's not difficult to imagine why we would say we have to extend that age range. And I just think our conversations need to be cognizant of that. At some point, we should have to change, and fit where young people are, but I don't think we're there yet. The last thing I'll say is, as somebody who works in the policy space and interact with young people who are interested in policy, I think one of the things we need to think about when looking at youth development work particularly is how are we accessing young people, and to do the work that we do in ways that all young people can locate themselves in. And so spaces like this and dialogues like this are all very fun for those of us that are interested, but how do we have these conversations with people who don't get in the room, and what are the ways in which we can work together to do that? Thanks a lot, David, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Okay, thank you very much, Pearl, and thank you so much to the panelists and everybody else who participated in this conversation. Your participation, even those that have not written or asked questions, by merely being present and being available for this precious time, it's highly appreciated, and it's quite invaluable, because we do not always participate by actively engaging. Sometimes we just listen, and then we take those conversations forward. Just to conclude at a very high level and quite very quickly, because I think we've run out of time completely. I think we're 8 minutes over. It is basically to start off by saying that we really have to answer the question, what is the state of youth in South Africa today? And is South Africa really marking time instead of actually making substantial progress? And I'm saying this because when I say South Africa, I'm not talking about government. And I'm happy that this conversation was not limited to government, because all the societies that have made progress on the most difficult questions in society have actually not relied on government, but have relied on government working with other partners in society. You look at China, you can go in the US, you can go any other country. Any constitutional democracy that promises a better life for all is meant to basically do that. So that's the first thing. But the second thing really is that the role of youth, the importance of youth and the agency of youth really lies in the area of agitation, the production of ideas and practice. Without agitation, production of ideas and practice, we cannot go anywhere. And I've made example about how, for instance, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, they were in their youth when they started the revolution in Cuba. You look at the Arab Spring, you look at June 16 and so on. So the youth are actually agents of change. They ask the most uncomfortable questions. They irritate people, they disturb and disrupt. And they do all sorts of things, but it's part of the agitation process and it's part of the agitation task that faces young people. The most successful, the other point is that the most successful states in the world basically rely on basically two things. That there will always be economic development on the one hand, but that economic development is actually a product of cooperation between the various sectors and in the main, between the state and the private sector. And that's very important because everybody has interest in the progress and the future that we face. A lot has been spoken about, but I think in my reflection, we actually remain a bit thin on actually the practice. And also, I think that South Africa remains one of the most risk-averse countries in the world. I don't know why. Even during COVID-19, we couldn't even build one COVID specialized hospital, that we can convert after the COVID-19 pandemic and then say it's going to be a general hospital that actually caters for everybody, because you need to have a lasting legacy. Each time you are faced with a crisis, you need to ask yourself, how best have you used a national crisis to actually build something more sustainable and more enduring? So in other words, you never have to waste a crisis. You must use that crisis to actually spur on a society, spur on a country, revive the economy and make sure that we make progress. So the issue of practice and being too risk averse is quite very problematic in our case. And we will probably, what I would want to propose is that maybe next year what we need to do is that we probably need to run sectoral workshops before we actually have the dialogue. So this is the inaugural dialogue. The second dialogue next year will probably need to have workshops in different sectors or different themes that actually explore the different areas in a more in-depth manner, so that we are able to delve into the issues in a more detailed fashion. And that will help us to actually make sure that the dialogue, when we get to the dialogue, the second dialogue, then we have got more key actors that are in place that can shape the conversations and the solutions, and that their insights and their proposals are actually being taken forward more meaningfully. So in the end, it's about agency, and I think young people must never lose that advantage. And I think it's quite very important, because we cannot move forward if we don't have young people that take their agency very seriously. And really, I think some of you have spoken to the question of vision, which is my last point, is that what really is the vision, right? And what are we doing in our political spaces? Whether it doesn't matter the ideological, the political beliefs that you subscribe to, but what really is the common and the national interest, and how do we actually take our society forward? And that becomes a very important space and an important task that we have. So with those few words, I'd really like to thank everybody. We hope that we can build this platform wherein we can have more people, more voices participating in this platform to actually enrich it and make sure that, you know, on an annual basis, we've got a very meaningful conversation that we can take forward in practical terms, but in terms of actually fashioning a new South Africa and a new reality for all of us. Thank you so much for coming. I think that our host, Sipho, thank you so much on the technical side. The people are going to be leaving now. Thank you so much. I know that most of your questions were not answered. Some were answered, but I think that the conversation goes on. We have got a website. We've got many other platforms on social media. You can interact with us. We can take the conversation forward, and we're open to more suggestions going forward. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Have a good evening. And thank you for being part of us in this conversation tonight. Thank you.